Bruce Goldstein is the president of Farm Worker Justice, a national nonprofit organization that works to empower migrant and seasonal farm workers by improving their living and working conditions. Recently, a new legislation, the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, passed in the House and is now waiting for a vote in the Senate. Bruce joins me to discuss farm worker justice and what this new legislation would mean for both farm workers and their employers. Welcome, Bruce. Thanks for coming.
Thanks so much for having me, Brad. I really appreciate it.
So what type of advocacy work does Farm Worker Justice do?
Farm Worker Justice seeks policy change in Congress and federal agencies. It also assists groups around the country on state advocacy. And we focus on immigration policy, labor rights, occupational safety, and health and access to health care. We believe that if we need more farm workers in this country, because there are not enough, that they should be offered immigration status and a path to citizenship. And employers in this capitalist economy should compete for those workers by improving wages and working conditions to attract and retain them. We have not been able to pass that.
How do you seek to change rules and regulations to assist your members?
Well, we start by educating ourselves about the facts on the ground and how policy works and what the law currently is. And we work with groups around the country to devise agendas to figure out what needs to change. And then we build coalitions. Farm workers themselves are not very powerful. So we work with farm worker groups, but many others, including the labor movement, environmental groups, civil rights organizations, Latino organizations, and many others, to build coalitions that then demand policy changes in Congress and in agencies.
So, for example, right now you're working on the Farm Workforce Modernization Act in Congress. It has already passed the House of Representatives. It is partly a immigration reform for farm workers who are out of status. Can you just give our viewers just what it takes from your organization and the other organizations that you coordinate with to get Congress to, even in the House, to pass this law?
I mean, let's face it, we all know that many members of Congress depend for their ability to get elected on campaign contributions. And farm workers and Farm Worker Justice don't have any money for campaign contributions. So we have to make up that source of influence in other ways. So we work together to educate members of Congress. We help farm workers come to Washington, D.C. to meet with members of Congress. We encourage them to go meet with their members of Congress when the members are back home in their districts and their states, and explain to them the life of farm workers on the ground. And when it comes to immigration policy, we've been working at this a long time. For many years, many farm workers have been undocumented, and we've been asking for immigration reform legislation that would grant undocumented farm workers and their family members the opportunity for immigration status and citizenship. And we've been rejected many times. On the other side, many agricultural employer associations have been saying that they're unhappy. And so some of them have been lobbying for really troubling legislation. It'd be very harmful to farm workers. They'd basically be able to bring temporary foreign workers in on temporary work permits with no rights and no access to the justice system, no path to immigration status or citizenship. And so what it's taken over many years is fighting against those proposals by agribusiness. And we've done that, again, by building coalitions, writing, visiting members of Congress, getting media, doing social media. And when efforts by the agribusiness groups and growers have been made in Congress, we've lobbied to defeat that legislation. So what's been happening over a period of years is that we've not been able to get past legislation that we've wanted, which would be very generous in its approach to immigration reform towards farm workers who deserve it. And the grower groups have not been able to get their immigration reform passed. And so there's been this stalemate. And that led some years ago to efforts to see if there wasn't some way to reach a labor management agreement that would also have the support of Democrats and Republicans.
And now you have this Farm Workforce Modernization Act. It passed the House of Representatives on March 18th. As you know, the last time special immigration reform was passed for farm workers was during the Reagan era, 1986, special agricultural workers. So how much bipartisan support did it have?
It had significant bipartisan support. Almost all Democrats except for one, voted for it, and 30 Republicans voted for this legislation. In the House, the two main leaders of the effort to pass the bill were bipartisan. One was Representative Zoe Lofgren, who chairs the Immigration Subcommittee in the House, and the Republican was Representative Dan Newhouse of Washington State, who was the Secretary of Agriculture of the state of Washington, and he is a farmer. In comparison to the rest of what's going on in Congress these days, that was pretty good.
Were you surprised you got that many Republicans?
I was expecting roughly that many. We hoped for more, actually, but immigration is an issue that a lot of Republicans want to oppose. They want to base their reelection campaigns on being anti-immigrant.
What did the House of Representatives actually pass?
Well, the Farm Workforce Modernization Act basically has two components. One is it would grant undocumented farm workers and their family members an opportunity to earn legal immigration status and U.S. citizenship. The second part of the bill would revise the H-2A agricultural guest worker program. And that is a program that it originates during World War II, and it allows agricultural employers to bring in foreign citizens on temporary work permits when they can show that there's a labor shortage. So the bill would basically create that earned legalization program and revise the H-2A program. Once a person has certified agricultural worker status under this bill for 5 years, and it shows that they have worked the requisite 100 days in agriculture per year, they can apply for a green card and get permanent immigration status. And 5 years later, they can get U.S. citizenship. And at the same time, the farm worker gets a green card, so with their immediate family members. So this access to immigration status and citizenship is opposed by a significant number of Republicans. And so the goal is to cobble together a coalition, a bipartisan coalition in the Senate that gets the 60 votes necessary to pass the bill.
Assuming the bill passes as it is written and passed by the House of Representatives, what would a farm worker have to do to become legal?
Well, let me preface this by saying that we have a lot of materials on our Farm Worker Justice website that goes through a lot of the details of the bill, the Farm Workforce Modernization Act fact sheet. So I encourage people to visit our website, www.farmworkerjustice.org. So for the legalization program, undocumented farm workers would be able to come forward and file an application. And they would apply for a certified agricultural worker status. And to do that, they would have to show that they've worked at least 180 days in agriculture in the United States in the last 2 years. And they would also have to show that they have not been convicted of serious crimes and that they've been in the United States, recently. And if they can prove that, then they would be granted a certified agricultural worker status, which basically is a temporary immigration status. They'd be allowed to stay in the United States, work in any job. They'd be allowed to travel abroad and return to the United States. And the status would basically last 5 years. If the person wants to renew, the person would have to show that he or she worked at least 100 days in agriculture in the United States each year. And let me back up and say that when the farm worker gets the certified agricultural status by showing that he or she has that experience in the last 2 years, their immediate family members, their spouses and minor children, would also get that same temporary immigration status. And that temporary immigration status also would last 5 years. They could work in any job in the United States, and the status would be renewable. They would not have to work in agriculture. And let me emphasize that agricultural work on farms and ranches in the United States is among the very lowest paying jobs in the United States. It is also ranked as among the most dangerous jobs in terms of occupational deaths and occupational injuries. Also, farm workers are excluded from many of the labor laws that protect other workers, like overtime pay after 40 hours a week. They don't get it. And the right to join a union free from discrimination or retaliation, they don't get that either. So this is one of the toughest jobs you can find in the United States. They have to prove that they've been doing it, and then they have to continue in it at least 100 days per year.
And I'd just like to say this, when somebody says we don't want people coming from another country to take our jobs, these are not jobs that they're taking away from American citizens. For the most part, American citizens don't want these jobs. Is that correct?
Right. More than 80% of farm workers are immigrants, and at least half the farm workers in the United States are undocumented immigrants. And, unfortunately, the jobs are low paying and dangerous. And so many people in the United States don't want to take these jobs. Part of our mission at Farm Worker Justice is to improve the wages and working conditions and occupational safety of agriculture so that farm workers are paid better, do work in safer workplaces, and that will in turn stabilize the workforce so that we will not keep having such high turnover. The estimate that we rely on, that a lot of people do, is that there are 2.4 million farm workers in the United States. And so there's an estimate from the US Department of Labor based on the Farm Labor Survey of Workers that about half the farm workers are undocumented.
So absurd when you think about these numbers. 50% of the people who grow the food that Americans eat are undocumented. And here's many politicians saying, throw them out of the country. We don't want them. What happens to our food supply if we don't have these undocumented workers working on our farms?
Right. My view is that the agriculture system in this country would collapse if we were to deport any significant number of farm workers from the United States. And it's never become more clear than during this COVID-19 pandemic, because the Trump administration made an official finding that the food and agriculture system is a critical infrastructure sector in the United States, and that farm workers are essential workers in that sector. So we've just officially said that these workers are essential to our economic stability and our ability to eat. So the refusal to recognize that the reality is that these people are here and we need them, and many are undocumented and should be given status, is just outrageous. So some people will say, oh, we're not going to really deport them. The status quo will keep. So what is the status quo? The status quo that half the farm workers in the country are undocumented. Most of them have lived here for at least 15 years. Most of them are married and have children. They're afraid to go to public places. They're afraid to go to the parent-teacher conferences with their kids for fear that immigration agents in farm worker communities might show up at the school and arrest and deport them. They're afraid to go to COVID-19 testing sites and vaccination sites, again, for fear that immigration agents will be there. They're afraid to say to their employers, I need a mask, I need more sanitation facilities to be able to wash my hands more frequently. I need other protections against COVID-19. I need paid sick leave. Many of them are just afraid to ask their employers for that because they're undocumented, and they're afraid that they'll be fired, and getting another job could be difficult. And they're afraid that somebody will call the immigration service on them and have them arrested and deported. So that's the status quo for at least half the farm workers in this country, and it needs to end.
How does it affect the average American who doesn't come into contact with these farm workers if they were to become legal?
Consumers want to know, and they're making demands, and they're going to patronize companies that can prove that the farm workers are being treated well. Second is the reason why there's a compromise between farm worker organizations and growers on this legislation is that farm owners are saying, we need our workers to hold a legal status. And the reason is that the lack of legal status interferes with their ability to make a profit. Farms are less productive when a lot of their workers are living and working in fear of being arrested. Some of them, for example, can't show up to work certain days because immigration agents in their ICE vans are roaming around their neighborhoods, their communities, and the farm workers stay in their homes and don't get onto the street to go to work. We work with a bunch of growers, and what they tell us is that farm work today requires the exercise of skill and judgment, not just bending over and stooping and picking fast. For example, when there's bird droppings and deer poop on crops like spinach and strawberries, farm workers today are being trained to make sure to report those things and to not pick those crops and to have it dealt with, because those kinds of contaminations of crops cause foodborne illness in human beings, the consumers. And a few years ago, virtually the entire spinach industry on the West Coast was shut down because of that. So growers want immigration reform and retailers want immigration reform because they want to be able to say to their consumers, this food is safe.
Let me ask you a question. End of the year, Farm Workforce Modernization Act passes or doesn't?
I think that there is a reasonable chance that the Farm Workforce Modernization Act passes by the end of the year. There are a lot of obstacles to it passing, but I think that with all of us working hard and getting your viewers to contact senators to tell them to pass it and ramping up the pressure in other ways, I think we get it done.
Can you explain the H-2A program, why it's not working for the farm workers?
The H-2A program, which originated in World War II, allows agricultural employers to apply for permission to bring in foreign citizens on temporary work visas for seasonal jobs. They're supposed to show that there's a labor shortage, and they are supposed to advertise the jobs to U.S. workers. And to show a labor shortage, they're supposed to advertise the jobs at wages and working conditions that meet the standards of U.S. farm workers. And if they advertise those jobs at those wages and working conditions and can't find enough U.S. workers, then they are permitted to hire foreign citizens who come in on temporary work visas in what's called a non-immigrant status. It's a very restrictive visa. Part of the reason why the H-2A program is so abusive is that the workers who come in may only work for the one employer that arranged the visa for them. They may only stay in the United States as long as the visa lasts, as long as the job lasts. And they must go home when the job ends. If they want to come back in a following season, the worker must hope that the employer will request a visa for the worker, because the worker has no ability or right to apply to the US government to get an H-2A visa. It's totally controlled by the employers. And they are very reluctant to ask for any improvements, to report illegal practices, and they work to the limits of human endurance. They do whatever the employer says to be able to keep the job and to be invited back the following year. Now, the employers, they complain about the program as being expensive. So only about 10% of farm workers in the United States are brought in under the H-2A program. But the program is one of the few programs in immigration that's unlimited. Employers can bring in any number of H-2A workers. The reason why more farm workers are not brought in under H-2A is that there have been ample numbers of farm workers in the United States, U.S. citizens, lawful permanent residents, and undocumented immigrants. So a lot of employers don't see the need to apply for H-2A. So the program is rife with abuses. And for years, we've litigated and advocated and worked with lawyers all over the country to fight these abuses, which sometimes are quite serious and amount to human trafficking.
What changes does the Farm Workforce Modernization Act do to the H-2A program?
So one of the big changes is that for the first time ever, the H-2A guest workers would be covered by the principal federal employment law for farm workers. There's an employment law called the Migrant and Seasonal Agricultural Worker Protection Act. It basically allows farm workers in the United States to know what their job terms are And then if the employer violates those job terms, file a lawsuit in federal court and enforce them. The law also regulates the use of farm labor contractors. That is, growers a lot of times hire labor intermediaries. They call them farm labor contractors. And the law requires that those farm labor contractors be licensed and requires the growers to use only licensed labor contractors. But there are many abuses. Growers hire labor contractors, they violate farm workers' rights. Then the grower says, I don't employ the farm workers on my farm. They're employed only by the labor contractor. We sue the labor contractor, they have no money. And so the grower gets off scot-free, the workers don't get anything, and the grower then hires another labor contractor who does the same thing. This Migrant and Seasonal Agricultural Worker Protection Act doesn't apply to H-2A guest workers. The Farm Workforce Modernization Act would apply it to H-2A guest workers and to the employers. So for the first time, the guest workers would be allowed to go to federal court to enforce their contract rights. And that is really, really important. Because right now, the H-2A guest workers, at best, they can go to a local state court and hope that a local judge under state contract law would be willing to rule in favor of them.
But if they do that, the employer is going to fire them. They're out of status and they'll never be able to come back here ever again in their entire life.
Well, but there are rules about retaliation. And now we'd be able to sue in federal court against the employer for that retaliation. And we'd be able to ask the Department of Labor to allow them to come back into the country.
What do you say to people who say, okay, great, we're not going to need any more farm workers because we're legalizing them all? But you just finished telling us that it's a very dangerous job and it's a low-paying job. So as soon as these farm workers get green cards, they're now going to go and take my job away in the auto body shop or in the store, or, you know, they're going to start competing for my job because they're not going to want to work on a farm. We're still going to have farm worker problems. We're going to need to bring in a whole new group of people from other countries.
We hear that argument a lot. Of course, this is a capitalist economy. We expect employers to compete for labor. And if this bill were to pass, and we'd have hundreds of thousands of newly legalized, experienced, skilled farm workers, these employers should compete for their labor by improving wages and working conditions and occupational safety. In addition, the large majority of farm workers, for them, this is their career. They don't go on to become computer programmers. And we are also optimistic that once these workers are legalized, a lot of employers who are very modern business people will recognize that this is an opportunity to transform the farm labor force and their practices to really modernize agriculture, to stop having this low wage, low productivity approach and work with workers who know their job and know how to make it more productive and more profitable, collaborate with them and to solve problems and have a win-win-win situation.
What does that do to the cost of apples in the store for the average family?
Glad you asked. It turns out that farm workers' wages are a tiny fraction of the price that consumers pay for their fruits and vegetables. This analysis shows is you can raise farm workers' wages by 40%. So let's assume the average farm worker, if they're lucky, is making $12 an hour on the West Coast. It's lower on the East Coast. You could raise their wages by 40%. That is from $12 an hour to almost $17 an hour. The increased price of food to the average household in the United States would be $25 per year. We can afford to improve farm workers' wages and working conditions in this country.
How do we support this? What do we do? Let's get this thing going and pass.
It's really important that people contact their United States senators and tell them to pass the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. What you can also do is support Farmworker Justice so that we can carry out this work by visiting our website, www.farmworkerjustice.org, and make a donation online. Farmworker Justice does not charge farm workers or their organizations a dime for any of the services that we provide. So we're dependent upon people like you to support us so we can help farm workers. And Brad, I really thank you for inviting me on your show to get the word out, because a lot of people don't know much about farm workers and the situation they're in and about immigration policy.
And I'm an immigration practitioner, and I learned a lot today. So thank you very much for coming on as well. Let's just talk a little bit about your career. So you've been with Farm Worker Justice for how long?
33 years.
Did you grow up on a farm?
No,
How did you get involved working for Farm Worker Justice?
I went to law school. And after graduating law school for about 8 years, I was a labor and civil rights lawyer in the Midwest, and then decided to move to DC with my wife and kids, and had the opportunity to apply for a job with Farm Worker Justice, and never expected to do this work. They were looking to hire a litigator, and I thought it would be really interesting given my interest in labor and civil rights and my college experience reading about farm workers. But I never really expected to deal with immigration law directly. My two sons, they each married an immigrant.
Oh, wow. Tell us what your American dream is.
My American dream is that we win immigration reform. And if it's not perfect to begin with, we improve it later so that the undocumented farm workers who are currently here in the United States get legal immigration status and a path to citizenship, and so that future farm workers who come into the country to help feed us also are given a true immigration status and path to citizenship. And that through that, we work with all those farm workers to mobilize them so they can ask their employers and their communities for a greater measure of justice in this country.
Bruce Goldstein, President of Farm Worker Justice. We are all behind you. We're supporting you. We all want this bill to pass. We are praying, and we're going to work to do it. Thank you very much for coming on. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.